Becoming the Guru, Personal Journey by David Russo, Chapter 1, The Restless Beginning. There was a period in my life when everything seemed orderly, yet nothing felt whole. From an outsider's perspective, it looked as though I had it all figured out. Obligations were met, milestones checked off, and people nodded with admiration at my story. Yet beneath the polished surface, something stirred, a quiet, persistent restlessness, like a distant drum that refused to stop. It followed me into crowded rooms and lingered in silent mornings. It whispered in moments of triumph and stayed long after applause had faded. At first, I couldn't name it. I only recognized it as a subtle tension, a sense that I was inhabiting a life that fit, but never truly belonged. Each day began predictably. I woke, dressed, followed routines that had once promised safety and success. But with every repetition, a faint numbness grew. Days passed in a blur, efficient, orderly, yet hollow. I fulfilled my roles well, but inside a deeper voice quietly asked a question I wasn't ready to hear. Is this all there is? The question unnerved me, not because I lacked answers, but because I sensed that answering it would require change. When night fell and the world quieted, the unease intensified. Lying awake in darkness, I felt the weight of unrealized potential pressing against my chest. It wasn't sadness exactly. It was a yearning, a hunger for meaning that no accomplishment could satisfy. A sense that life, awareness, and consciousness had been entrusted to me, yet I was squandering their gift. I began to notice fragments of insight that cracked the illusion of certainty. A line in a book would pierce deeper than expected. A stranger's calm presence would radiate something I lacked. A fleeting moment of stillness during a walk would reveal the constant noise in my mind. These glimpses unsettled me. They hinted at a different way of living, not in endless striving, but in understanding. Not in proving worth, but in discovering truth. Once the idea emerged, I could no longer ignore the gap between who I was and who I could become. Yet I resisted it. I reminded myself to be grateful, to honor responsibilities, to cling to familiarity. I buried the questions under busyness, under distraction. But like a seed beneath concrete, the restlessness pressed upward, patient and unyielding. My struggle was quiet. There were no dramatic crises, no sudden breakdowns. Instead, it was a slow erosion, a subtle realization that I was drifting from myself. I felt divided. One part of me sustaining the life I had built, another longing for a life that felt true. In that division, I felt profoundly alone. Slowly, I began to understand that this unease was not a defect, but a signal, a call to explore more deeply, to ask more meaningful questions, to listen more carefully, to turn inward rather than always outward. Still, fear lingered. Fear of losing what I had constructed. Fear of disappointing those who relied on me. Fear that if I peeled back the layers, I might find nothing or worse, something I would have to face. But curiosity grew alongside fear. A quiet, insistent curiosity that asked, what if this discomfort is an invitation? What if dissatisfaction is not failure, but the spark of awakening? I had no concept yet of the word guru. I didn't envision myself as a guide, a teacher, or a master. At that stage, I was simply a seeker who had yet to admit it, a traveler, standing at the edge of an immense inner landscape, unsure whether to step forward or retreat. What I did know was this: the life I was living no longer aligned with the life I sensed was possible. And once that awareness emerged, it could not be undone. The restlessness became my companion. It walked beside me through ordinary days, reminding me that comfort without meaning is a quiet prison, that achievement without purpose is an empty crown, that growth begins not with answers, but with honesty. I began to notice my avoidance of silence, my constant need for distraction, validation, or noise. And in recognizing this, I glimpsed the heart of the struggle. I feared being alone with myself. That realization marked the true beginning of the journey. Before mastery comes awareness. Before transformation comes dissatisfaction with the old way of being. Before becoming something new, one must admit that the current self is incomplete. This chapter did not close with clarity or resolution. It ended with a question, a living, insistent question that refused to let me rest. Who am I beneath the roles, achievements, and expectations? I did not yet know where it would lead, but I felt with certainty deeper than reasoning that life could never be the same once I truly began to search for the answer. And so, quietly, inwardly, the journey began. Chapter 2. The first questions. Once restlessness awakens, it does not fade on its own. It sharpens. It demands attention. After admitting, if only to myself, that something was missing, I could no longer move through life on autopilot. The routines remained, but my relationship to them had changed. Every habit, every belief, every goal I once accepted without question now stood before me like a doorway asking to be opened. For the first time I began to question not what I was doing, but why did I measure success the way I did? Why did I fear stillness more than exhaustion? Why did I feel guilty when I rested, yet empty when I achieved? These questions followed me everywhere. They turned simple moments into mirrors. Conversations became revealing, not for what was said, but for what was avoided. I noticed how often people, including myself, repeated ideas we had inherited rather than examined. We spoke of normal life, practical choices, and being realistic, yet beneath those phrases I sensed unchallenged fear. And I realized something unsettling. Much of my life had been shaped by expectations I had never consciously chosen. This realization brought both excitement and unease. On one hand, the possibility of freedom stirred something alive within me. On the other, doubt crept in. If the foundations I stood on were borrowed, what would happen if they cracked? Around this time, new influences began to appear quietly, almost mysteriously. A book found its way into my hands, its pages marked with ideas that felt less like information and more like remembrance. It spoke of awareness, discipline, and the inner life. It suggested that suffering was not always something to escape, but something to understand. I read slowly, sometimes rereading the same paragraph over and over, not because it was difficult, but because it felt dangerous. Dangerous to the identity I had built. Dangerous to the story I told myself about who I was. Soon after, I met someone who carried a different kind of presence. They did not preach or persuade. They listened. When they spoke, their words were simple, but they landed with weight. There was a steadiness about them, a calm that did not depend on circumstances. Being near them stirred both admiration and discomfort. I wanted to ask, what do you know that I don't? But the deeper question was, what have you become that I am not? As my curiosity deepened, so did my confusion. The more I questioned, the less certain I felt. Old beliefs no longer satisfied me, but new ones had not yet taken root. I stood in an uncomfortable in-between space, no longer asleep, but not yet awake. Doubt intensified. I doubted my instincts. I doubted the path I had been on. I doubted whether this inner search was wisdom or self-indulgence. Some days I longed to return to ignorance, to the ease of unquestioned living. At least then the ground beneath my feet had felt solid, but once the mind begins to open, it cannot be forced shut. I noticed how easily frustration with myself for not having answers, with others for seeming so certain, with life for refusing to explain itself. I felt exposed, as if the armor I once wore had been removed before I had learned how to stand unprotected. And yet, beneath the uncertainty, something else was growing. Hope. A quiet hope that this questioning was not a mistake. That confusion might be a necessary passage rather than a dead end. That unknowing could be fertile ground. I began to sit with questions instead of rushing to resolve them. I experimented with moments of silence, noticing how restless my mind became when it was no longer entertained. I observed my reactions, how quickly I defended my opinions, how deeply I clung to being right. These observations were humbling. They revealed how little mastery I truly had over my own thoughts and emotions. This realization stung. I had believed myself to be in control, yet my inner world told a different story. Thoughts arose without permission. Emotions dictated behavior. Fears disguised themselves as logic. For the first time I saw that the greatest mystery was not the world around me, but the world within me. The questions multiplied, but so did my willingness to face them. I did not yet know where this path would lead. I only knew that pretending no longer worked. The search had begun, not because I sought enlightenment or power, but because I could no longer tolerate living without truth. And in that uncertain space between old certainty and new understanding, I took my first real step toward self-mastery, not with confidence, not with clarity, but with honesty, and that I would later learn is always where the journey truly begins. Chapter 3. The Call to the Unknown. There comes a moment in every true journey when understanding is no longer enough. The questions I carried had grown heavier, pressing against the walls of my carefully managed life. Reading, reflection, and conversation had opened doors within me, but I had only stood at their thresholds. Insight without action began to feel like another form of comfort, and comfort, I was learning, was no longer my ally. The call to change did not arrive as a dramatic announcement. It came as a quiet, persistent knowing. If I stay here, I will betray myself. What here meant was not just a place, but a pattern. A job that rewarded predictability over truth. Relationships that felt familiar, but no longer nourishing. Habits that dulled the ache of restlessness without ever addressing its cause. None of these were wrong, but they were no longer right for me. Letting go of them felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, unsure whether there was ground beneath the fog. Fear surged quickly. Practical fears, money, stability, reputation rose first, armed with convincing arguments. Then came deeper fears. Fear of isolation, fear of failure, fear that I would wander and find nothing. The mind, skilled in self-preservation, urged retreat. But something stronger had awakened. A quieter voice, less articulate, yet more truthful, whispered that growth requires risk, and that remaining unchanged was the greater danger. I began to understand that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to move despite it. The first steps were small but deliberate. I said no where I had always said yes. I created space where there had been none. I loosened my grip on identities I had clung to for safety. Each act felt like stepping into cold water, shocking at first, then strangely clarifying. Soon, unfamiliar environments replaced familiar ones. I traveled not just across distance, but across inner terrain. Retreats, periods of solitude and intense study stripped away distraction and forced me to face myself without escape. Without the usual markers of success, I felt exposed, raw, unpolished, and uncertain. In these spaces I learned an uncomfortable truth. Discomfort is a teacher. Days were not filled with inspiration, but with resistance. The body protested stillness. The mind rebelled against discipline. Old patterns resurfaced with renewed force, as if demanding one last chance to rule. There were moments when I questioned everything, why I had come, what I was seeking, whether I had misunderstood the call entirely. But within that struggle, something essential was happening. Each challenge revealed how deeply I had relied on external structure to define me. Without it, I was forced to build an inner foundation. I learned to sit with unease rather than escape it, to observe fear without obeying it, to stay present when every impulse urged distraction. I began to sense a shift, a subtle strengthening that did not announce itself loudly. Confidence no longer came from certainty, but from resilience. I discovered that I could survive confusion, loneliness, and doubt. And in surviving them, I grew. There were moments of awe, too. Unexpected beauty and simplicity. A sunrise that felt like a conversation with something vast and patient. A shared silence with strangers that carried more truth than many words. These moments did not answer my questions, but they reminded me why I had chosen to walk into the unknown. Slowly I realized that the unknown was not an enemy. It was a field of possibility. Every comfort I released created space for awareness. Every fear I faced expanded my capacity to remain present. The path did not make me special or enlightened, but it made me honest. And honesty, I was learning, is the foundation of all transformation. The call to the unknown was not asking me to abandon my life. It was asking me to inhabit it fully, to stop living from habit and start living from intention. By answering that call, I crossed an invisible threshold. There was no applause, no guarantee of success, only a quiet recognition. The journey was no longer theoretical. It had entered my bones, and though I did not yet know where this path would lead, I knew something with unwavering clarity. I would never again mistake safety for truth. The unknown had claimed me, and in its uncertainty, I felt, for the first time, truly alive. Chapter 4. The Mirror of the Self. The unknown does not merely challenge the body or the mind. It reveals the self. Once the outer structures of my life had loosened, I could no longer avoid what lay beneath them. The silence I had once sought as peace became a mirror, clear, unforgiving, and exact. In it, I saw not who I wished to be, but who I actually was. And what I saw unsettled me. Fear appeared first, not the obvious kind, but subtle and strategic. Fear disguised as caution. Fear wearing the mask of reason. It whispered that I was not ready, not worthy, not disciplined enough to continue. I had believed fear was something to overcome, but now I saw how deeply It lived inside my decisions. Then came anger. Old resentments surfaced without warning toward others, toward circumstances, toward myself. I noticed how easily irritation flared when things did not unfold as expected, how pride resisted correction, how judgment arose before understanding. These were not new traits. They had always been there. What was new was my inability to look away. The practices that once felt grounding now felt confrontational. Stillness exposed restlessness. Discipline revealed resistance. Awareness shone a light on habits I had justified for years. Each day felt like standing before a mirror that refused to flatter. At times, the weight of this recognition was overwhelming. There were moments when I longed for distraction, anything to escape the intensity of self-observation. I questioned whether this path was healthy, whether too much introspection could fracture the spirit rather than free it. Some nights the doubt grew so loud it echoed through my chest. Then failure arrived, not as catastrophe, but as collapse. I broke commitments to myself. I reacted when I intended to remain calm. I sought validation when I had vowed to remain inwardly anchored. Each failure stung, not because it shocked me, but because it exposed the gap between intention and embodiment. Shame followed close behind. I judged myself harshly, believing that awareness should equal mastery. But the mirror showed me a deeper truth. Seeing the shadow does not mean it disappears. It means it finally has a chance to be understood. In one particularly difficult moment, when frustration peaked and the desire to abandon the path felt strongest, something shifted. I stopped fighting what I saw. I stopped trying to fix, suppress, or transcend my flaws. Instead, I stayed. I allowed fear to exist without justification. I allowed anger to be felt without expression. I allowed pride to be noticed without feeding it. For the first time, I met my inner darkness, not as an enemy, but as a teacher, and in that meeting, I discovered compassion, not the soft, indulgent kind, but a steady compassion rooted in truth. I realized that every shadow had once been a strategy for survival. Every defense had protected something vulnerable. Every flaw carried a history. This understanding did not excuse my behavior, but it transformed my relationship to it. The mirror no longer felt like an accusation. It became an invitation. I learned that mastery does not begin with perfection, but with radical honesty. That growth is not the elimination of darkness, but the integration of it. The more I accepted my humanity, the less power it held over me. There were still setbacks, still moments of collapse. But now each failure became a doorway rather than a verdict. Instead of asking, "What is wrong with me?" I began to ask, "What is this revealing?" This shift changed everything. I no longer sought to become someone else. I sought to become whole. The mirror of the self continued to reflect uncomfortable truths, but it also revealed strength I had never acknowledged. Patience growing where reactivity once ruled. Humility emerging where pride had stood guard. Presence forming in the space where avoidance once lived. This chapter of the journey was not triumphant. It was quiet, demanding, and deeply human. Yet it forged something essential, trust in my ability to face myself without turning away, and I understood with sobering clarity, one cannot guide others through darkness without first learning to sit calmly in one's own. The mirror had done its work, and though the reflection was still unfinished, It was finally honest, comma, from that honesty, true transformation began to take root. Chapter 5. The first spark. After long seasons of confrontation, the soul begins to recognize subtle light. It did not arrive as a thunderbolt or a permanent state of peace. There was no moment when the sky parted and certainty poured in. Instead, the first spark appeared quietly, almost shyly, as if testing whether I was ready to notice it. One morning, in the midst of ordinary practice, I realized my mind had grown still without effort. No force, no struggle. Just a brief, natural silence. It lasted only a few breaths, yet within those breaths was a clarity unlike anything I had known. Nothing extraordinary happened, and yet everything felt different. In that stillness, I was not striving to improve myself or escape myself. I was simply present, awake, whole. When thoughts returned, they no longer felt like tyrants just passing weather across a wide sky. That moment ended, but it left behind a trace, a knowing the path was working. This realization did not inflate my ego, it humbled me. I saw clearly that insight cannot be conquered. It emerges when conditions are right. All my effort had not been about forcing transformation, but about preparing the ground. Small victories began to surface. I noticed myself pausing before reacting, choosing silence instead of defense, listening more deeply without rehearsing my response. These shifts were almost invisible from the outside, but internally they felt monumental. For the first time, I understood that mastery is not dramatic, it is subtle. I also recognized a hard truth. Knowledge alone had carried me only so far. I had read the books, studied the ideas, learned the language of growth. But understanding concepts was not the same as living them. Wisdom demanded embodiment. Mentors reinforced this lesson gently, but firmly. They pointed me away from accumulation and toward integration. Do less, one said, but do it fully. Another reminded me that spiritual insight without practice becomes vanity, so I committed to simplicity. Meditation became less about achieving calm and more about cultivating honesty. Reflection became a way of listening rather than judging. Acts of service, small, uncelebrated, became a practice in dissolving self-importance. I learned that helping others was not a distraction from the path, but an expression of it. The spark grew brighter through consistency, not intensity. There were still difficult days, still resistance, still moments of doubt, but now, beneath all of it, there was trust. I trusted the process, even when progress felt slow. I trusted that growth was unfolding in ways I could not always measure. At times, awe would arise unexpectedly. A simple breath would feel sacred. A shared laugh would feel like communion. A moment of compassion, given or received, would open something tender and expansive inside me. These moments did not make me feel special. They made me feel connected. I began to sense a quiet joy, unlinked to circumstances. Not excitement, not pleasure, but a steady warmth that remained even when challenges appeared. It felt like alignment, like walking in rhythm with something larger than myself. And yet, the most important realization of this chapter was this: the spark was not the destination. It was an invitation to continue, to deepen, to commit, to understand that awakening is not a single event, but a living process, one that requires humility as much as courage. I no longer chased enlightenment. I practiced presence. I no longer sought to escape my humanity. I learned to honor it. The first spark did not make me a teacher. It made me a student in a new way, one who understood that every moment holds the potential for insight, and every challenge carries a lesson. As this chapter closed, I carried no grand claims, no titles, no certainty of where the road would lead next. But I carried something far more valuable, a quiet confidence rooted not in belief, but in experience. The light had appeared not to blind me, but to guide me forward, and with that light, however small, I continued the journey, one breath, one practice, one honest moment at a time. Chapter 6. The Forge of Discipline. The spark, once lit, demands fuel. In the early glow of insight, it is easy to believe that clarity will now arrive effortlessly, that awareness, once tasted, will remain. But I soon learned that insight without discipline fades as quickly as it appears. What remains is not inspiration, but choice. And choice must be practiced. Discipline entered my life not as punishment, but as devotion, not a rigid structure imposed from outside, but a commitment forged from within. I began to understand that freedom is not the absence of form, it is the mastery of it. Each day was shaped by simple, deliberate acts. I rose early not because it was impressive, but because the quiet hours revealed my mind most honestly. I practiced even when nothing profound occurred, especially then. Meditation, movement, reflection, study, these became anchors rather than aspirations. At first, resistance was relentless. The mind negotiated constantly. You've already grown enough. You can rest today. This isn't making a difference. I saw how easily motivation evaporated when comfort beckoned, how quickly old habits resurfaced when vigilance softened. Discipline, I discovered, was not about intensity. It was about showing up when enthusiasm disappeared. Some days felt painfully ordinary. There were no breakthroughs, no revelations, just repetition. The same breath, the same posture, the same effort to remain present. I questioned whether this steady labor was leading anywhere at all. But slowly, imperceptibly, something began to change. Patience deepened. My reactions softened before they hardened. I noticed a growing space between impulse and action, a space in which choice lived. That space was small at first, but it was powerful. It was the birthplace of freedom. Discipline revealed its true gift, resilience. I learned to continue without reassurance, to practice without reward, to trust that consistency was shaping me in ways I could not yet see. The forge does not ask the metal if it is ready, it applies heat until strength emerges. There were temptations, too. The temptation to compare my progress to others, the temptation to rush ahead, the temptation to wear discipline as an identity rather than a tool. Each temptation carried the same lesson. Ego will always try to reclaim control.
I met these moments not with force, but with awareness. I learned to balance effort with surrender, to work diligently, then release attachment to outcome. This rhythm, effort, and ease, structure, and flow became the heartbeat of my practice. The body grew steadier. The mind grew quieter. The heart grew more tolerant of discomfort.
I began to sense when to push and when to rest, when to speak and when to remain silent. Discipline sharpened intuition rather than dulling it. It taught me that true strength is adaptable, not rigid. What surprised me most was how discipline spilled into every aspect of life. Conversations became more attentive. Choices became more intentional. Even conflict carried less urgency. I was no longer reacting to life, I was meeting it. This chapter was not glamorous. It did not make for impressive stories, but it built something essential: trust in myself. I trusted that I would not abandon the path when it grew tedious, that I would not betray my deeper intentions for temporary relief, that I could carry responsibility for my own growth without resentment. Discipline became an act of self-respect, and in that respect I found quiet pride, not the loud, brittle kind, but a grounded confidence, the kind that does not need to be seen to be real. As the forge continued its work, I understood a truth that would guide me forever. Transformation is not born from rare moments of brilliance, but from ordinary moments lived with extraordinary commitment. The spark was no longer fragile. It had become a steady flame, and with discipline as my ally, I walked forward stronger, steadier, and prepared for the next meeting that would change everything. Chapter 7. The Teacher Appears. There is a moment on every sincere path when guidance arrives, not because it is sought, but because it is earned. By the time the teacher appeared, I was no longer searching for answers with desperation. Discipline had quieted the urgency within me. Practice had taught me patience. I had learned how to listen to myself, to silence, to life. And it was in that listening that the door opened. The teacher did not arrive with ceremony. There were no grand declarations, no instant recognition of significance. At first, they seemed ordinary, unassuming in presence, precise in speech, attentive in a way that made me feel fully seen. What struck me was not what they said, but how they listened. Their stillness carried weight. Their attention felt undivided. Being near them felt like standing before a clear lake. Every movement within me reflected back without distortion. I quickly realized this was not a teacher who offered comfort. They offered clarity. They did not tell me who to become. They showed me where I was hiding. With carefully chosen words and sometimes with silence, they revealed patterns I had grown accustomed to excusing. Ego, once subtle, now stood exposed. Not condemned, but unmistakably present. This was unsettling. I had learned discipline. I had tasted insight. I had faced shadow. And yet, in the presence of the teacher, I saw how easily pride disguised itself as humility. How often I clung to identity, even the identity of a seeker. The teacher challenged me not through criticism, but through precision, a raised eyebrow, a single question, a pause long enough to make me uncomfortable. These moments cut deeper than lectures ever could. They taught me to observe before interpreting, to listen without preparing response, to speak only when clarity replaced impulse. Every interaction became a lesson not delivered, but embodied. What I learned most was this: wisdom cannot be borrowed. The teacher refused to give me answers I had not lived into. When I asked for certainty, they returned me to practice. When I sought validation, they pointed me toward silence. At times, frustration arose. I wanted reassurance. I wanted acknowledgement of progress. Instead, I was given responsibility. Responsibility for my attention. Responsibility for my reactions. Responsibility for the subtle ways I still sought approval and control. Under this guidance, growth accelerated, but not comfortably. There were moments when I resisted, when I felt misunderstood, when my ego whispered that I had already learned enough. Each time, the teacher met me with the same unwavering presence. No indulgence, no dismissal, only truth. Over time, something profound unfolded. I stopped trying to impress. I stopped trying to perform understanding. I began to show up as I was uncertain, learning, incomplete. And in that honesty, trust deepened. The teacher did not claim authority. They demonstrated alignment. Their life was a teaching, how they walked, how they spoke, how they treated the smallest moments with reverence. Watching them, I understood that mastery is quiet. It does not announce itself. It reveals itself through consistency and care. Gradually, I realized the teacher was not shaping me into a follower. They were preparing me to stand on my own. They reminded me, often without words, that dependence is not devotion, that true mentorship awakens inner authority rather than replacing it. Their greatest lessons were not about what to think, but how to see. As this chapter unfolded, my gratitude deepened, not as admiration, but as recognition. Recognition that guidance appears when humility is ready to receive it. That the right teacher does not give you power, they show you where you have always had it. And quietly, unmistakably, I sensed a shift. The student in me was maturing. The teacher had appeared, and through them the path ahead became sharper, steeper, and more real than ever before. I stepped forward, knowing that the next trials would not be faced alone, but that I would still have to walk them myself. Chapter 8. The Shadow Battle. Every path of transformation leads, inevitably, to a reckoning. I had believed the hardest work was behind me. Discipline was steady. Guidance was present. Awareness had deepened. But wisdom has a way of revealing itself through challenge, not comfort. And so, without warning, the ground beneath me gave way. The shadow returned not as a stranger, but as an old companion wearing new faces. Doubt crept in first. Subtle, persuasive. It questioned the value of everything I had committed to. What if this path is an illusion? What if you are only convincing yourself you are growing? The questions echoed louder than before, sharper, because they came armed with experience. Then came temptation. The familiar comforts I had outgrown reappeared, polished and inviting. Old habits promised relief. Old identities offered certainty. The pull was strong not because they were better, but because they were known. I felt the exhaustion of always choosing awareness over ease. Emotion followed swiftly behind. Unprocessed grief surfaced. Anger rose without clear target. Loneliness settled in like fog. The practices that once grounded me now felt dry, mechanical, even futile. I sat in silence and felt nothing but resistance. I showed up and felt absent. This was the dark night I had heard others speak of, though no description had prepared me for its intimacy. The battle was not dramatic. There were no external enemies, no visible failures. The struggle unfolded entirely within a war of attention, faith, and endurance. Each day asked the same question: will you stay even when nothing reassures you? At times I faltered. I doubted the teacher. I doubted the practice. I doubted myself. Shame whispered that I had regressed, that all previous insight had been fragile and false. The mind demanded proof of progress, and when none appeared, it threatened retreat. In one of the lowest moments, I considered walking away, not just from the path, but from the effort of becoming anything more than I already was. The burden of growth felt heavier than the weight of stagnation, and then something unexpected happened. I stopped fighting, not in defeat, but in surrender. I let go of the demand to feel strong, clear, or faithful. I allowed myself to be uncertain, exhausted, and human. I sat in the darkness without trying to illuminate it, That surrender changed the quality of the struggle. The shadow did not vanish, but it softened. Fear loosened its grip when I stopped resisting it. Doubt lost its authority when I no longer obeyed its urgency. I discovered that the battle was never about winning. It was about staying present. In vulnerability, strength emerged. I learned that mastery does not mean invulnerability. It means remaining open when closing would be easier. It means choosing integrity when no one is watching. It means trusting the process when evidence is absent. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the darkness began to teach. It taught me humility, the kind that cannot be performed. It taught me compassion for others who struggle silently. It taught me that surrender is not collapse, but alignment with something deeper than control. When light returned, it did not arrive as relief. It arrived as understanding. I understood that every ascent requires a descent. That shadows are not obstacles to awakening, they are part of it. That the self must be stripped of illusion before it can stand in truth. The battle did not end with triumph. It ended with integration. I emerged quieter, less certain, more grounded. The need to prove had dissolved. The need to know had softened. What remained was presence steady, resilient, and real. This chapter left its mark. It taught me that the greatest teacher is not success, but surrender. That true strength is revealed when nothing props it up, and that the path does not promise comfort, but it does promise truth. I walked forward changed, carrying fewer illusions and deeper resolve. The shadow had not defeated me. It had shaped me, and in that shaping, I became ready for the light that would rise next. Chapter 9. The Rising Light. After the long descent, illumination does not arrive with spectacle. It comes softly, almost unnoticed, an unhurried dawning, rather than a sudden blaze. Yet once it settles in, everything is changed. The world looks different. The self feels different. There is no returning to what was. The seasons of surrender and shadow had reshaped me. I was no longer the one who first stepped into the unknown months, perhaps years ago. Fear and doubt still surfaced, but they no longer ruled. They walked beside me instead of ahead of me. In their loosening grip, a new cadence emerged, a quiet harmony between what I knew and how I lived outwardly. Life began to move with an ease I had not known before. Choices no longer demanded force. They unfolded with calm precision. The mind, once crowded with argument and noise, grew still enough to reveal something gentler beneath it, an intuitive current that asked only to be trusted. I learned that true authority does not come from accumulation of knowledge, but from grounded presence. Insight lost its drama and gained its grace. Understanding appeared in ordinary moments, in a pause, a gesture, a single breath. What once felt complex now felt obvious. Growth revealed itself in subtle ways, responding with patience instead of reaction, offering kindness without calculation, listening without preparing a reply. These moments passed unnoticed by most, yet they quietly altered everything. I saw how the lessons had fused into lived experience. Learning alone had opened the door, but embodiment carried me through it. Practices that once required structure and effort now wove themselves naturally into daily life. There was no longer a division between spiritual practice and ordinary living. Every interaction became instruction. Every challenge reflected back the state of my awareness. Nothing was separate. Everything belonged. Compassion flowed without strain. I recognized myself in the struggles of others, softened toward faults I once criticized. Humility took the place of self-importance. The ego still existed, but it no longer steered the course. I understood then that growth is not measured by accomplishments, but by the ability to remain steady, open, and kind, regardless of circumstance. Joy emerged in the same quiet way as the light. It was not dependent on success or approval, not tied to events or outcomes. It was steady, luminous, and self-sustaining. I saw clearly that happiness is not pursued. It arises naturally when life is lived in alignment with truth. With this inner clarity came an unexpected shift. Guidance began to happen on its own. There was no need to display wisdom or assert authority. Simply living with attentiveness and sincerity became enough. Others responded not to words, but to presence. And there was no sense of elevation in this only responsibility. Real change, I realized, is never imposed. It is transmitted through authenticity. The road ahead remained uncertain, and the shadows had not disappeared forever, but they no longer inspired fear. I had learned how to meet difficulty without collapse, knowing the light within could always be accessed, even when obscured. Confidence replaced certainty. Trust replaced control. I moved forward, grounded not in answers, but in faith in the process itself. This stage of awakening revealed a deeper understanding. Mastery is not an endpoint. It is a continual unfolding, renewed in each moment. Every situation offers alignment. Every encounter carries instruction. Every darkness contains the beginning of clarity. As the light continued to rise within me, the truth became undeniable. Transformation is not about shedding who we are. It is about inhabiting ourselves fully, the shadow and the brilliance, the fragility and the strength, the silence and the knowing. The rising light felt nothing like victory. It felt like belonging. And from that place of belonging, I was prepared to continue to serve, to guide, and to walk forward along a path shaped equally by darkness and illumination. Chapter 10. Becoming the Guru. What began as unease and uncertainty gradually revealed a quieter understanding. Mastery is not a finish line. It is not a badge, a role, or flawless comprehension. Mastery lives in awareness. It lives in service. It is the harmony between one's inner being and the ever-moving rhythm of life, expressed in thought, word, and action. By the time this phase emerged, I had already crossed countless inner thresholds. I had stepped into the unknown, met my darker edges, endured discipline's refining fire, and tasted moments of clarity. Along the way, I learned that bravery can exist alongside fear, that yielding can be powerful, and that wisdom does not reside in ideas alone, but in how they are lived. Still, becoming a guide for others was not about collecting milestones. It was about weaving everything together. Humility was the first doorway. To truly support others, I had to loosen my grip on approval, authority, and the need to be seen as accomplished. The version of myself driven by certainty and status had to recede. The journey made one thing clear. Ego cannot illuminate the way. Only grounded presence can. Only truth embodied through lived experience can serve as a light. Teaching, then, emerged naturally, not through dramatic proclamations or complex ceremonies, but through sincerity, through attentive listening, creating space for others to discover their own insights, and guiding without forcing conclusions. I came to see that transformation rarely comes from instruction alone. It arises from witnessing a life aligned with honesty, courage, and care. In that reflection, others recognize what is possible within themselves. At first, offering guidance felt fragile. Doubts surfaced questions about competence and responsibility. Yet with time, clarity followed. Guidance does not require flawlessness. It requires attentiveness. When presence is complete, even silence carries meaning. When action flows from integrated experience, both light and shadow included, what is offered is not rigid teaching, but grounded direction. Service revealed itself as mastery's true expression. Whether through conversation, shared practice, or quiet availability, I learned that giving does not deplete, it deepens. Supporting others in confronting their shadows sharpened my own awareness. Walking beside others toward clarity strengthened my own steadiness. The exchange is mutual, alive, and endlessly renewing. Still, becoming a guru is never a conclusion. It is a continual unfolding. Growth does not cease. Refinement never ends. Even with experience, ego can reappear masked as insight. Old temptations return in familiar forms. Uncertainty still lingers. The difference lies not in their absence, but in how they are met with observation, balance, and surrender. Gradually, I understood that a true guru is not defined by authority, but by openness. Not by superiority, but by having traveled deeply through confusion, fear, and awakening, and now walking with sincerity and compassion. One who can sit with another's struggle without judgment, who can point toward the path without demanding it be followed, who lives truth without claiming ownership of it. Ultimately, the realization settled in. The journey never stops. Becoming a guru is not an achievement. It is an ongoing practice of learning, integration, and offering. Each day invites deeper attention. Each interaction becomes an opportunity to live wisdom rather than speak it. Each moment calls for service. So I continue forward not as someone who has arrived, but as someone who remains engaged. The restlessness that once propelled me has reshaped itself into intention. The doubt that once disrupted me now fuels curiosity. The shadow that once threatened me has become a guide. This is what mastery reveals itself to be. Presence in each moment, devotion to service, and commitment to the path, without expectation of completion. To guide others is to keep walking oneself. To become a guru is to live fully, integrate honestly, and share generously. The road does not conclude, it widens. And as I move along it, I remain both learner and teacher, explorer and companion, always evolving, always attentive, always becoming,